Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Allie Libb, and I'd like to welcome you to our fifth in our Future of Work webinar series titled How to Create Memorable Virtual Trainings. ReadyTalk is pleased to bring you this six-part webinar series, which is designed to provide you with an inside look at the state of today's business environment and how key components are adapting to technology. Experts in office design, IT infrastructure, workplace process, and training will share their expertise and experience to provide you with key takeaways from each session. So before we get started, I'd just like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and a corresponding handout will be emailed to you after the event. Also, if you have questions during today's session, please feel free to submit them using the chat feature that's located at the bottom left of your screen. Also, there's going to be some calls to participate throughout today's presentation, so make sure to use the chat feature if you want to participate and give your answer for those questions. And last but not least, if you'd like to contribute to the social conversation around the event, please use the hashtag FOWWS. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Carmen Simon. Carmen is co-founder of Rexy Media and the brains behind the Rexy Method workshops. An experienced cognitive scientist, she's a frequent keynote speaker at conferences in the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Asia. She holds doctorates in instructional technology and cognitive psychology and uses her knowledge to offer presenters a flashlight and a magnet, one to call attention to what's important in a message and the other to make it stick to the audience's brain so they can act on it. So, and last but not least, her book, Impossible to Ignore, was just released and is available on Amazon. So with that, Carmen, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Allie, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I have been researching this question from a neuroscience standpoint. Are we impossible to ignore, especially as the world is getting bombarded with information, and we text and blog and Twitter and engage in so much media? At what point we become impossible to ignore? And I will provide answers to that question throughout our session. But first, I'd love to hear from you. What do you believe, or who do you believe, is impossible to ignore? Use the chat box that Ali mentioned, and I'd love to hear your reactions. I've been asking this question for the past few weeks since we've been focusing on finding some answers after my book release, and I'd love to know what your input is. So, Ali, as you're seeing the answers coming in, let me know which ones catch your attention.
Okay, great. We're still waiting for some people to chat in stuff.
In previous sessions, when I asked this question, the answers ranged from fire trucks that are impossible to ignore, bills and debts that people have, their spouses or aging parents, so some answers were very touching. Chocolate and wine were prevalent on that list of answers. Donald Trump, we couldn't ignore him. Anything else or anyone else that you see on our list, Ali?
We still have some stuff coming in, but politics was one of them. That's impossible with the media right now. The Kardashians are impossible to ignore. Linda said my parents and children.
Yes, so notice how our answers tend to range from the trivial to the very serious. And as we reflect on what or who is impossible to ignore for your own personal or professional lives, then we'll see what are some techniques that we can apply to our own content, whether you work in training or marketing or IT or sales, operations, whatever your job title is. We have got to answer this question, because otherwise, if we are ignored, then it is much harder to stay in business. And I've been noticing this progression that in order to become impossible to ignore, you obviously have to stay on people's minds. So you have to progress from something that is good to something that is better to something that is memorable. And why do I mention this? Because you become impossible to ignore when you can linger on someone's mind long enough in order for them to react. So I'm curious, what would you consider a progression from your own experiences when it comes to good, better, impossible to ignore? So return to that chat box and tell me your combination of these three factors. I'm sure that in your experiences, your observations, you've seen this progression of something moving from good to getting better to really staying in your mind long enough for you to react to it or act on it. Good, better, impossible to ignore. Use the chat box and tell me what your examples would be for this. Ali, tell me a few things that you see from our participants. I'm displaying here on the screen some answers that I received in previous similar sessions. Notice how as we move from the office to a park to Bora Bora, or jog, sprint, and then streak, or go from single to being married to having a family, sitting or running or staying fit, those match this progression of good, better, impossible to ignore. Ali, are you seeing some similar responses?
Yeah, so one is college, graduate school, PhD. Another one is kind of talent contest to pop star to Grammy. And that's what we have coming in right now. So.
And displaying a few others from previous sessions. I particularly enjoyed this gentleman's entry, my wife, in various circumstances, or notice how somebody moved from a smile to a giggle to a belly laugh. And for many of you, whatever type of content you create or you deliver, when you tell an audience how to do it, show them how to do it, or let them do it, that too matches that progression of good, better, impossible to ignore. And that progression sits at the foundation of today's session, because we're advocating that in order to become impossible to ignore, you have to stay on people's minds long enough to generate a reaction and action. So what are some things that we can learn from neuroscience, from brain science, in terms of memory? And here's the first principle that I'm excited to share with you, and it's at the foundation of the book that I just released. Namely, that memory is at the root of all decision making. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. We have to step back and ask, how is it really that the brain decides what to do next? We decide our next choice in one of these three ways. One way that we decide is reflexive. So for instance, if you touch your hand on a hot surface, it doesn't take many iterations to realize that you shouldn't do that anymore. All you have to do it is just once. So our bodies already and brains come equipped with this innate, pre-wired behaviors, so the memory is already a given, so to speak. You know instantly what to do or what not to do next. Another way of deciding what to do next is based on habits. Unlike reflexes, which are automatic and subconscious, we decide what to do next based on many actions that prove to us to be rewarding and based on arbitrary associations. So for instance, if you take the same route to work every single day and it proves to be rewarding for you because you get there on time, then you tend to repeat that over and over and over. So from that regard, memory is almost memorized algorithm, so to speak. You repeat the same rule over and over because it proves suitable. It's important to realize the difference between these two, because while reflexive are subconscious and automatic and require very few cognitive resources, habits are conscious at first, and after enough repetition, they become subconscious and also require very few cognitive resources. Contrast this with another way in which we decide what to do next, and that is a goal-oriented way, meaning that it is possible for us to change our mind in light of new information. So for instance, if we see a construction sign on this habitual way to work, it is possible that based on some other circumstances where we realize that if we were to still go with a habit, we would probably be in trouble, then we are willing to take a different route. Unlike this two that are automatic, and this one is more strategic, this requires a lot more cognitive resources. And I'm mentioning this distinction because quite often the mistake that content creators make is to deliver or create content to our audiences that is so focused on appealing to people's goals and making them think at the expense of this too. And it's unfortunate because after a long day at work or after a long week when we are exposing the brain to yet more information that requires thinking, it's no wonder that people ignore that information altogether. And what do? They revert to habits or reflexes. And one of the first set of guidelines that I'll share with you is then to make sure that whatever content you create, whether it's a virtual training session or whether it's a blog or whether it's a marketing campaign, make sure that you link it to people's reflexes, habits, and goals, primarily to reflexes and habits, especially if you know that you're talking to audiences who are tired, sleep deprived, in a partial state of attention, which describes most of our audiences most of the time. So let's look at some examples for each of these three. Because if we say, okay, the brain decides what to do next based on reflexes, what is that information really? What are our reflexive responses to things? And I'm displaying here on the screen a few examples that will give you a good list of what reflexive responses are. So when it comes to memory, we have this innate memory that brings us biological value, and we react to things that give us rewards, or we react to things that avoid punishments for us. So for instance, we react reflexively to sweet taste. We react reflexively to odor. We react reflexively to pain or snakes or flowers. What is more likely to power our content in a business setup is this reaction to altruism or the reaction to control our environment. And I'll give you an example of how these are reflected in actual content that is business-like. It's important to realize that these are primary reinforcers of behavior, and they are contrasting with secondary reinforcers, such as money, for instance, or promotions, which have to be learned. They're not given. They're not innate. And here's how these are reflected in business content or advertising content. For instance, I smiled at this ad by the company 3M. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it. And notice how they very wisely appeal to our reflex of controlling our environment. And if we use their product, we very much can take control over our words or our action. Very smart campaign. Here's some examples from a collection of presentations that we have done for our clients. Our company, Rexy Media, creates presentations by using brain science guidelines. And with each one of these files, we implement these ideas of how does the brain decide what to do next, even if the next action is simply paying attention to what the client has to say. And notice that in these four examples, they're from various industries. This one is from e-commerce. This one is from the presentation, and they were talking about the industrial internet. This is from an entertainment company. This is from a predictive analytics company. This is a keynote speech. Notice the need for aesthetics and beauty. Earlier we were saying that we reflexively react to flowers or aesthetics. And you don't have to think too much to react and to pay attention. In fact, it takes more effort to ignore these kinds of designs than it does to indulge them. So in your content, in your virtual sessions or face-to-face sessions, if you are using, for instance, slideware, they're not always mandatory, but if you are using media, just know that aesthetics is more and more of a factor these days in getting attention. And the reason it works is because the brain does not think in order to pay attention. It simply does. Here's another example from a presentation we did at the time for AT&T. We're appealing here to the brain's innate reflex to controlling its environment by proposing that presentation was and the content in it was offering no boundaries if you were to apply its content. Here's one that appeals to our reflex of nurturing, and it takes more effort to not pay attention than it does to pay attention. So consider reflexes and linking your content to them, because the advantage you have to that is that you are not making an audience think. given a choice to your audience's brains to think or not to think, we prefer to take the path of least resistance. And it's the same with habits. Typically, we look at stimuli around us, and we are constantly seeking rewards, constantly avoiding punishment. And once we realize what actions get us there, we tend to repeat those over and over and over. In fact, use the chat box and share with us what are some habits that you have that serve you well. So let's go for the positive first. I'd love to know, as you're listening to this content and you're attending this and reflecting on your own routines, what are some habits that serve you well?
Jody is saying walking. Another one, exercise, meditation. Starting early, waking up early to get things done is another one from Lindsay.
Nice. And now let's go for the opposite list. What are some temptations that you have which sometimes don't serve you well?
Sweets is one from Jody again. Watching cult TV is another one that just came in. Putting things off, procrastinating.
So notice how the brain engages in these activities, whether they serve you well or they don't serve you well, but you are getting some rewards in either situation, whether it's exercising or meditating, whether it's watching TV and eating desserts. Your brain engages in those because it so enjoys the sweet nature of those results, metaphorically and literally speaking in some cases. And our habits are conscious at first, they become automatic later, and there's a point where, in fact, we become our habits in a sense. And quite often, we don't have to think of those activities. You don't have to think so much when you exercise. You don't have to think so much when you're watching TV. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we gravitate to that remote. It's mindless. And notice that your audiences are no different. Given the choice to think or not to think, they would rather go for their existing habits. This is why it's often not easy to invite people to your virtual sessions, to your content in general, and expect change instantly. And that's because we are so powered by habit in many things that we do. And we have, as neuroscientists, to ask this question: what is it really that happens in the brain when it comes to the habit formation and indulging our habits? And some of the newer research that we're having in this area have to do with this brain region that is called the striatum. The striatum has many functions. They range from controlling your movement and those rewarding experiences that you're just talking about, ranging from the exercise to the sweets to the watching of the TV. The striatum also has some functions when it comes to our cognitive powers as well. But let's just focus now on these, because this is what's enlightening us in terms of why is it that the brain loves so much in engaging in our habits. There was a recent study that was done on monkeys, and the experiment went like this. The monkey was asked to look through a grid of dots, and initially they would look at them in a random pattern until they realized that once their eyes were focusing on one specific dot, that dot was baited, in the sense that when the eyes would rest on it, the monkey would get a squirt of juice. So they would find that rewarding. And also, whenever the eyes would go over that specific dot, not only would you get a squirt of juice, but then the rest of the colors of the dots would change. So, in a sense, announcing that there is a reward that is coming. So, in time, the scientists were observing these experiments, and they were studying about 1,600 neurons that were located in that striatum region. And this is what they realized, that as the monkeys were at first going through this grid randomly, after a while, they started forming patterns on their own, and they started having a more systematic way of looking at this grid and almost anticipating this reward and, in a sense, knowing where to look. And the firing of the neurons became a lot more precise and a lot better timed, therefore requiring a lot less energy. So we're realizing that as we form habits, one of the biggest advantages that we get out of them is a more systematic and the more efficient neuronal energy. This is why we love them so much, because the more we engage, the less energy we have to expand on them. And while habits give us that freedom because we don't have to think so much as we engage in them, of course there's a drawback to them because we, in a sense, we become prisoners of our habits. So it's not that they come with advantages all the time. But when we reflect on how to apply these neuroscience-based principles to our content creation and to the way that we engage with our audiences, whether virtually or face-to-face, we have to ask, what is it that we can do to indulge some existing habits, especially the ones that serve people well? So take Facebook, for instance. I'm surprised that part of your list didn't include it, or maybe the answer came in later. I'm sure that at some point somebody did mention Facebook. And let's just say that we wanted to convince an audience to be more productive at work. That's a new habit we would like them to create. One of the easiest way to create that habit is to link it to an existing habit. And if we look at Facebook, which is so prevalent and in many cases has become an addiction for quite a few people, imagine if we were to say, if you wanted to develop a new habit, each time you see a Facebook notification on your computer, you write a sentence that is related to work. This is one of the ways to avoid that procrastination that some of you were reporting. So see how it's a lot easier to convince somebody to engage in something new if you ask them to link it to something that's existing already. This is huge enlightenment for all of us, because quite often we have this tendency to start from scratch. We just do a lot of research and we have a lot of stats and data regarding our content, and we share that with our audiences without stepping back and asking, how does this fit within something that is habitual already? Because when you ask that question, the reward that you get is the fact that people have less to think about. I was impressed by this company. This is a company that operates in the quote-to-cash business. Many of you may be familiar with that phrase. And what I enjoyed about their software is even though it's a fairly complex technology and it might require a lot of thinking and a lot of cognitive resources to handle it well, what they did in a brilliant sense is that they linked their software with Salesforce, which is already habitual for many of its users. So they did not reinvent the wheel. They didn't start from scratch. They went to where the brain of their users already was in Salesforce, and then they created from there. So ask the question of yourself and of your own content. Whatever I'm proclaiming right now, whatever change I'm asking of my audiences to do, is there an opportunity to link it to a habit that they already have and serves them well? Here's another example from a presentation I remember we did a while back for Boeing. We wanted to explain to them 3 new concepts that were new for them, not new for us. So we stepped back and we asked, what is it really that they see in their own world habitually? Do they have a structure that contains 3 pillars so that we can attach our structure of 3 pillars onto something that is already easily recognizable and familiar to them? So we knew that for that particular audience, these 3 elements that you see here on the screen were something that would be easily recognizable, not much to think about. So we linked our own 3 things: presentation content, presenter skills, and the delivery platform. This is what we were presenting on, and linked them to those 3 things that were familiar to them. And in the end, I remember talking about this idea of memorable experiences, and even the design of the presentation was linked to something that they also found familiar. So imagine this. Often we err on the fact of wanting to impress an audience with novelty. Every single minute we feel like we have to put in something that they may not have seen before, or something that they will be surprised by. But it's a shame to always think that way, because whenever you're combining something that may be new with mostly something that people find habitual and familiar, you will keep the brain engaged for longer, simply because people do not feel that they have to work hard at getting close to your content. And the third aspect of what does the brain do in order to make a choice is related to goals. So it is possible for the brain to change its behavior in light of information. It is possible for the brain to spend cognitive resources thinking about what may happen next, especially based on previous experiences, and that's where memory comes in as well. When it comes to goals, we have a lot to choose from in terms of appealing to an audience. And as you will see, if you end up reading the book, The Impossible to Ignore book, there's a list in there where I talk about what is it that people value, because our goals are a function of what it is that we value. And you will see based on this list that I'm displaying here on the screen, quite often we choose based on what we find functional, something that is highly tangible. It can range from something as small as a detergent or toothpaste that we choose to a marketing platform that we decide to implement. Of course, our goals are often based on emotional experiences. If you think of products such as the GoPro, I'm sure many of you are using it, or even having dinner with friends or socializing, those kinds of goals have emotions at their basis, and they will power what we decide to do next. We also have this epistemological way of choosing, in the sense of seeking knowledge and the origin of that knowledge. This is why we enjoy books. This is why we enjoy attending webinars like this. And that's a goal that powers our next choices. Aesthetics, of course, does not need any kind of explanation. This one, where we're constantly after experiences that make us feel good. I'm smiling at this graphic that we selected for the screen, because I'm seeing a revival of these record players and how much they make people smile these days. Sometimes, based on the situation, we make a choice whether to drink wine or champagne, and that would dictate, the situation dictates what we do next. And sometimes we're after multiple of these elements that are gathered up all together. A vacation in Paris will meet most of this criteria already that is listed here on the screen. And I'll share some examples from actual presentations that we've done for clients, and that list is available in the book. Here's an example from a presentation for HP. I'm enjoying this because initially and instantly the first screen that people see, has a promise that appeals to people's goals. We want what's in the future now, and that is the promise that people get from the very start of the presentation. And the rest of the presentation I enjoy because it appeals to several of those goals that I just listed, in terms of looking for the emotions and for the aesthetics and for the situation and for hedonistic power. So here's a comparison between the office of the past and the office of the future, and how we're moving away from those older elements to this newer and very slick elements. And that is the promise of the presentation, to give you technology that applies to these three elements that our audiences tend to look for these days, especially when it comes to computing and the office of the future. And what's driving that office of the future? Here are some characteristics and some forces, millennials in particular. So those are just a few screenshots from that presentation, but I'm sharing this because it is possible to appeal to people's goals, as long as you know what those are and what are the elements that power them. Here's another example from a presentation that we are doing on buying insights. And I really enjoyed how we're making the audience think just a little bit, because notice how some elements are not that instantly obvious, such as these icons here that symbolize a group getting together and finding some insights in order to win other people's business. And here's another screenshot from a presentation for a company called the Higher Brain. And here we were appealing to the goal of what happens next and being predictable, so the predictability of the higher. Here's one that appeals strictly to the goal of aesthetics. This is to advertise this type of perfume. And notice how there is a lot of variety, or moving from perfume to predictive analytics. And this is the very functional and situational goal for this company and for their audience. So as we look at how does the brain decide, we can summarize those decisions into automatic, such as reflexes and habits, and strategic. So for instance, let's just say that you're sitting at your desk and you're thinking, I'm craving something sweet. That is your reflex talking. you want to reach for the Kit Kat bar. You're thinking, a Kit Kat bar will be really good right now. And that other voice in your head says, can I really afford the calories? And that's the voice that makes you think. So moving from automatic to strategic, you too would have to ask of your own content and of your own efforts in terms of attracting attention of an audience. How much energy do you think they will have for you at any given moment? Hardly ever do we start developing content and delivering it asking that question. Because, for instance, if you have a virtual session very much like we're doing right now, let's just say at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and maybe for some other time zones it's even later, it'll be impossible for me to change your behavior, to convince you of anything, just because simply you will have depleted your energy for that day. The brain has a limited amount of willpower, and the more you expand it through the day, the less you have of it as the day progresses. This is why when you come home from work and you open your refrigerator, it is very likely that you will be reaching for the chocolate and not for the broccoli. So ponder this dichotomy between automatic and strategic and allow yourself to create content from those answers. And as I'm speaking about this and sharing some examples, Allie, do you see some questions or reactions from the audience so far?
We don't have any specific questions. Some people are asking about, if this is going to be recorded just because they're enjoying it so much. So, just letting people know that it will be recorded. But other than that, we don't have any content-specific questions.
Oh, good. So you can keep on using the chat box if you do have some questions or reactions, and I'm glad that you are enjoying the content. One of the frequent questions that I get in terms of habits versus goals is how do we know if the brain decides based on something that's automatic or something that's strategic? And the way that we can answer that is based on laboratory exercises and experiments that have been done. For instance, when you take a rat and you have a lab experiment that goes like this, you're giving the rat the ability to press a lever, and you're teaching it to press a lever, and as a result, it gets a reward. Let's just say there is some cheese that is being provided. So obviously the rat is willing to go through the motion in order to get that reward, which feels very satisfying. And after a while, after a few of these sessions, you devalue this reward. And what do I mean by that? You can give the rat now access to as much cheese as it wants, or you can put in some substances in this cheese that makes it so unappetizing that the rat becomes sick after eating it. So then you have to ask the question, will the rat still press the lever knowing that this reward has been devalued, and will the rat act based on past satisfaction or on past consequences? And the answer that we're finding is this. After the rat has been exposed to about 5 sessions of this training, you press the lever, you get a reward, press the lever, you get a reward, versus 20 sessions of this habitual action, those rats that have been engaged in longer training are still likely to act based on habits versus based on goals. So once you devalue that reward, it depends on the amount of exposure, and that's what gives us the clue as to whether the brain will act on automatic or strategic thinking. So as you reflect on your own content and on your own audiences, constantly ask this: how much have people been exposed to a specific context, a specific skill, a specific habit that you want to change? Because the longer an audience has been exposed to something, the harder it is to get them off the automatic and put them more on a strategic path. If your audiences have been exposed to a way of doing things for a very long time, then be prepared to change their habits in smaller components and be prepared to exert even extra time and effort in order to change that, because that change is not going to be that easy. So ask constantly.
Carmen,
what is it
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. Someone had a question. She says, how does this work with people? Could you give an example?
Yes, so the same experiment was done with people when we're talking about the devaluing rewards. So if we were to come back here, so once we start doing experiments with in labs with animals, then we transfer that onto people and say that there's the same thing applied to humans. And it did. We have the same conclusion for human participants. In those experiments, we used nachos that became devalued, or in some instances, chocolate. And it's the same result. The longer the brain has been exposed to a training session, the more it tends to act the next time based on habit. So you're still mindlessly going through an effort in order to get a reward, even though you didn't have to. And that's when we step back and we realize that the conclusion is, be prepared then if your human audiences have been exposed to a lot of stimuli for a long time. That means you have to put more effort into changing those habits. Your effort is not going to be as easy as something that has been around for a brief period of time. And as you investigate your own audiences, constantly ask, what is it that they crave? What is it that they go towards naturally? What is it that they do frequently? What goals do they value? And once you find the answers to those questions, know that whenever you're hooking into existing habits and existing reflexes, you're going to have a much easier time making some changes versus appealing to goals right off the bat, which is the mistake that most people make. Any other questions or reactions as you're looking at my screen, as you're pondering things that I'm sharing?
There aren't any other questions at this time.
Good. So we can move on to another aspect. When we talk about influencing people's memory, because that's how we know you become impossible to ignore, we said that memory is at the root of all decision making. What I also found in my research as I was writing the book is this aspect that may be a bit contrary to popular belief, which is that memory has not evolved to simply help us keep track of the past. Memory has evolved to help us keep track of the future. And that is the premise of the book. And it has given me a lot of satisfaction because I love debunking popular myths. Obviously, when we talk about memory, we're thinking constantly of the past. But there is a point that I want to make about constantly looking to the future. And the way to make that point is that I'd love for you to be involved in a very brief exercise. As you're attending this session, you're probably at some sort of an office. Maybe it's a formal office. Maybe it's an informal one at home. But somewhere around you, there is something that you should trash but cannot. I'd love for you to use your phone and take a picture of that object and send me 2 or 3 sentences as to why you cannot part with it. And I will review those carefully. I will also switch my computer screen so we can see some of your entries. Let's take about a minute to complete this. It should be a very fast exercise. I'm curious to see your entries, and I'll help you link whatever examples you're sending me to the point that I want to make about memory and how that can impact the content that you create for your own audiences. So send me those examples. Let's take exactly 1 minute, and I have a prize for the most creative entry. 1 minute, and I'm looking forward to your entries. I'll be switching my computer so I can share. And Ali, if you're seeing some other questions meanwhile or some observations, also address them. You have my email on the computer screen?
Sure. So another question came in. How would you train a person to be mindful of a goal, say, to be healthy and avoid sweets based on your research?
Mm-hmm. So assuming that you want to change someone's habits, let's just say that they're eating way too much chocolate, and suddenly you would like to replace that with eating a lot of something else that's healthier. I'd love to know what your equivalent would be. But if people are eating chocolate, usually a habit is based on and rooted into 3 elements. There is a cue. There is something that's triggering that habit. There's the routine that's going on, so the actual action of eating the chocolate, and there's the rewards that the brain receives. So changing any of those 3 will help you change the habit. So when it comes to eating sweets, you have to ask, what is it really that triggers that? For instance, here at my office, there's a specific chair that anytime I sit in that, I'm thinking, I would really love some chocolate right now. When I'm in another room in the office, I don't have those kinds of cravings. So the darn chair is triggering, it's acting as a cue for this habit that I enjoy so much. So simply sitting somewhere else is helping me out. In your audience's circumstances, those cues may be different, but simply asking what's the trigger can help you out. Changing that trigger can help you out. The routine itself is eating the chocolate, so another way to change habits is to change the routine. So instead of I'm sitting in that chair, instead of reaching for the chocolate, if on the table next to the chair I have something else to reach for that's also sweet, because I'll speak about rewards in just a second. Why am I eating it? Because the result feels so good to the brain. So eating or reaching for a readily available piece of apple, which is also sweet, it may help me out, and the proximity is also very helpful. And realizing what the reward is can also help you change the habits, because if I feel that the reward is instant energy, then instead of reaching for the chocolate, maybe I reach for some hard coffee candy. And the calories may not be as much. I still get something sweet, and I still get the energy of it that I find rewarding. So see, appealing to any of those three, whether it's the cue, the routine itself, and the reward, can help you get there. And I'm monitoring my email. Let's see if we received any examples. And I'm very excited to switch once I hear from you. Any other questions, Ali, or anything else that you see?
Not at this time. We just had that question, and I think that was a great explanation for that. So
let me switch to my email here, and I see a picture, and that's yours. I love this because you're talking about magazines, and we ran a similar session, and this was I want to say the prevalent graphic and the prevalent image that we received of people's old magazines, and I am just as guilty. We hold on to them just because maybe someday we are going to engage with them and find some information that we just simply cannot find anywhere else. I selected a picture from a previous presentation as well. This is Ali. This is similar to the one that you sent, and I so enjoy the explanation. This person said that these are old technical manuals for appliances and other mechanical objects around the house. He said all of the rational reasons why she should get rid of them. And if you go through the explanations really quick, you realize that, yes, all of the reasons in the world are there in order for her to dispose of them. But she's not, because she's saying, why is she not getting rid of them? Well, she's the fear of letting go, just like with the magazines. And there's that what-if factor. What if she throws them away and suddenly she needs that one particular one that she just disposed of? And there's another one from Connor. We see here, this is an emergency medical application dongle for a laptop that I no longer have. I hate to throw it away anyway. This is a beautiful picture, and I have about 10 of them that would match your own example from laptops that were current maybe 10 years ago, and yet we hang on to them for some reason. And that reason is not magical. Science is helping us understand why is it that we still have this fear of letting go, why that what-if factor. And that's because the brain has evolved in order to constantly track the future. This is why mindfulness and meditation is so difficult for some, and being in the present is so hard, because we constantly tend to go to the past, extract some lessons, and immediately project them onto the future, onto what may happen there. And here's an example that I really enjoy. This is from a sports, from an athlete. His name is Killian Jornet. And he's an athlete who's famous for a new trend that is happening in mountain climbing and running at the same time. He recently climbed Mount McKinley. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the mountain. He climbed it in 11 hours and 48 minutes. Imagine, almost 12 hours, when most mountaineers take days, if not weeks, to get up to the top. People like me will probably need 2 weeks to get there. This guy did it in 12 hours. An amazing feast. And when he's interviewed, he was recently interviewed by Outside Magazine, and they were asking, how in the world were you able to accomplish something so extraordinary? And he sounds so humble about it. He says, well, I used my skis for most of the trip up there. At some point, I had to put on crampons because there were some more challenging parts. And quite often, because of the extreme conditions, imagine you have wind and you have fog, you can barely see. He had to ski more by feel than by sight. He made it there. He spent about 10 minutes at the top enjoying his success, and he came back down. The trend that he's famous for is this thing called FKT, fastest known times, meaning that whatever sports you choose to engage in, whether it's running or whether it's skiing or mountain climbing, you just get up and go. There are no rules, no regulations to guide your behavior. It's just whatever can get up there to a specific goal the fastest. And he remembers doing this incredible accomplishment with only 1 liter of water. Imagine this. And he also confesses in his interview that he had one energy bar that he ate. He had brought another one, but he didn't eat that one, so he made it on only one energy bar. And then he remembers coming back down, spending the day sleeping and recovering a bit, then going, eating some chocolate, by the way, since we're talking about the indulgences that we all have and temptations. And then he remembers going back up to about 14,000 feet to spend some time with some of his friends who are waiting to celebrate with him his amazing accomplishment. And then at the end of it all, meeting with his friends and skiing the Orient Express, which is a nearly 45-degree mountain, and reflecting on this experience and confessing that this is all not about winning, but it is about improving. And here's a picture of that 45-degree slope that they skied together under the midnight sun. And when asked what's next for him, like where do you go from here when you make such amazing accomplishments, he says he wants to do Mount Everest in 55 hours. Imagine this. This is where most people who even attempt to do that need 5 weeks just to acclimate. He wants to do the whole thing in 1 weekend. So as we look at this, and if we were to put Killian's brain in an MRI machine, this is the insight that we would have, and the knowledge of this will transform the way that you create content in your virtual sessions, anything that you do for an audience. If we were to put his brain in an MRI machine, we would realize that as he's reflecting on the past, the same brain areas that are engaged in bringing back past memories are exactly the same brain areas that are necessary to pre-experience or to imagine the future. The brain draws from the same neural networks. And what are those pieces of information that we use, or the brain areas that we activate when we look at the past and the future? Usually we engage our visual cortex. So we go back onto visuals that happened in the past, just like when he's telling us a story about Mount McKinley. He talks about the skis and the crampons and the chocolate and the tent and his friends. He talks about where all this took place. It was Mount McKinley. It was the Orient Express that they skied. He talks about facts. It took him 11 hours and 48 minutes. He talks about conceptual information or personal meaning, such as this whole thing is not about winning. It's about improving. All of these take place whether you're reflecting on the past or whether you're pre-experiencing the future. And of course, there are some differences between the two, where the brain is concerned. The two obviously have a different temporal orientation, and quite often images from the past are more vivid than what you can imagine in the future. And when you imagine the future, you tend to combine old things perhaps in new ways. That's even a sign of creativity. But for most part, the brain networks that are related to the past similar, quite often the same as imagining the future. So the reason I'm sharing all of this with you is because remembering the past, which is called retrospective memory, is quite useful in what your audiences are going to do next. But it's remembering to act on a future intention, or prospective memory, that is really keeping us in business. Because if you think about it, there's very little evolutionary advantage to simply recalling the past. The only reason why you want your own audiences to remember you is because you want them to act in your favor sometime in the future. Whether that future is 2 days from now, whether it's 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, you would like people to remember you long enough in order to act. So as you reflect on your own content, then you wonder how can I create it in such a way that people will remember and act. Imagine this: you share content at any given point at point A. Even for us, this webinar is point A. So you may be delivering a virtual session very much like this. Maybe you're creating a blog or a marketing campaign, or you have some specs for an IT audience. That's point A. And you hope that whatever you're sharing there stays on people's mind long enough so at point B, 2 days, 2 months, 2 years later, they will still remember and act. And what does that act include? If you would like people to obviously like you or hire you, promote you, recommend you in some way, buy something that you have, the actions differ. And of course, the time in between, the longer it is, the more you have to revise your tactics. Because obviously, if you only want people to like your slide share and to recommend it to others, then the action is different compared to if you want to teach people new skills or if you want to make $1 million sale. But regardless of how long the time lapse in between, the action is still the same. Can you apply point B communication techniques in what you share? And notice how the tactics are different, but what's not different, what stays the same, is this idea of applying a prospective memory model in whatever it is that you'll create. And in order to abide by that, then we ask, from a neuroscience perspective, what is it that people will need at point B in order to remember and act in your favor? At point B, people typically notice a cue, just like I was talking about my chair and the chocolate. So there's something that triggers a memory. Then they search their memory asking, what was I supposed to do? And then if the motivation is strong enough, they execute on an intention. If we know what people need or what's likely to happen at point B, then we know to adhere to these 3 aspects here at point A before it's too late. Because the mistake that a lot of communicators make is that they create something here at point A and they leave the rest to chance. It's a random process. It's a chance-oriented process. It's not a deliberate one. Now, I'll show you an example that will change the way that you create content forever. I'm enjoying this so much because it illustrates the ability to think at point A what people may need at point B in order to remember and act. Let's just say for a moment that we wanted to teach an audience to eat in a healthier way, very much like your earlier question was related to the same thing. And at point A, let's just say that we show people the typical pyramid for healthy eating. I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, and you know what constitutes the foundation of the pyramid and what you should have less of as you go towards the top. And that's point A communication. You might share slides with people. You might share an infographic. You might write a blog about it, whatever that content type is. What is it that people are likely to see at point B that will trigger a memory, that will help them search their memory and realize what to do, and not only remember, but actually act on that memory? And let's just say that at point B, people see food, whether it's in a buffet context like this, or whether you're going to the grocery store, or whether you're simply opening up your refrigerator. What is it that you could do here that they could act, or you're increasing the chances to act here? And one of the best examples I've seen done is these organizations that are now creating these plates that are already in the shape of what you should be putting on them and in what proportions. So as you're seeing the actual plate and that has imprinted on it the amount of food and the proportions and the type that you should put on there, then you're increasing the likelihood that people will notice that. They'll search the memory remembering that pyramid and more likely to execute on an intention. So I'm asking you to consider a similar technique. At point A, can you design something that is very likely then available at point B and can trigger a memory, can enable people to even search through the memory repository and remember whatever you consider important, and increase the chances that they will act? And here's the biggest mistake that I consider people to make is at point A, we design randomly. We design without point B in mind. And when we do that, We are neglecting this prospective memory, and the shame in that is that the brain is constantly on fast forward. We're always, always anticipating what will happen next. We're always in the next moment already. So meet people in the future and design from that perspective already at point A. Before we finish, I'll give you a brief example. Remember that Higher Brain company that I was exemplifying a bit earlier? Initially, when we asked them, what is it that you would like to include in your presentation and in your training, they gave us these 3 sections that they would like to use. Most people in some way have some 3 sections, 3 supporting points, and the 3 sections would have looked similar to the previous screen. But then when we asked, what is it that your audiences are actually going to see at point B? Is it really those 3 sections? And then they said, well, no, actually they will have access to a tool that will enable them to make a good hire. And that tool is going to be arranged in these 3 different categories. So see how now we recreated the whole training, so instead of looking like the previous screen, it's now based exactly on the organization of the tool that people are likely to see at point B. And the colors are exactly the same, the verbiage is exactly the same with what is likely to trigger a memory at point B. So show at point A what they're likely to see at point B, and you're increasing the chances of these 3 phases to be catered to. So here's the conclusion for that section. You can email me for a visual handout, and you have my email address here listed on the screen. And if you do end up reading the book, you will find out even more things for today's session. There's another concept that I think you'd enjoy about adaptive coherence, and you'll find out what that is. Allie, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for your focus on the session. And I look forward to hearing from you. And please stay in touch. I guarantee that as you look and you use any of these techniques, you will become impossible to ignore.
Great, Carmen. Thank you so much for a great presentation and obviously getting to a ton of those audience questions and making everything really interactive and great today. So just before we go, Ahmad has a question. Is there an audio book available of your new book?
The book will be available as a hardcover and on Kindle, and it hasn't been turned into an audio one, but hopefully that will be the case given its success.
Great, awesome. So here's just a little bit more information on the book. We will, in our follow-up email that we're going to send to everybody, we will include a link to that. And then let me just go to our last slide here. And Carmen, I know you put your email information out there. So if you do have additional questions for Carmen or want to get in touch with her, please feel free to email her. As we already mentioned, we're going to be sending out a link to the recording in the handout. So Carmen, again, thank you so much for the presentation today. And I think everybody found it really valuable. So we'll be in touch soon with the follow-up. So look for that in your email. And other than that, we're done for today. So thank you so much again, Carmen, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everyone.